Thank you everyone for coming in, and I see a few more people coming in as we speak, but we'll just get started because I know we're conscious of time. My name's Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and it's a real pleasure to be your host for this session. We'll go about 45 minutes, and I'm going to save the last 10 minutes or so for questions from you. So raise your hands and I'll come to you. I really do believe in the wisdom of crowds, and we've got a very wise crowd here, so I'd love to incorporate some of your thoughts in the discussion. Before I introduce my guests, you all are here because you know the panel topic. We're here to discuss misinformation and the war for truth. You've all seen the session notes, so I won't waste too much time on that, but just a quick thing. You all know that misinformation, of course, is spreading falsehoods, but without necessarily intent. And I just want to make sure we distinguish between that and disinformation, which is the malicious, intentful, deliberate spreading of misinformation, which is going to be very crucial for this discussion, and you'll see why. So let's introduce our guests. I'm going to push all of them to move us towards solutions, because sadly we're all familiar with the problems at hand. And here's my panel. So I have Her Excellency Emine Dzhaparova. She is the first Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you for being here. There's Todd Helmus. Thank you. Thank you. And there's Todd Helmus. To her right, he's a senior behavioral scientist at Rand Corporation, and also Elizabeth Linder is the founder of Brooch Associates. In a previous life, she worked for Facebook, where she was often called Facebook's first Secretary of State. Those are our panelists. Welcome to all of them. Quick round of applause. Okay, we'll get started now. I'm going to move into disinformation and misinformation right away, but before that, Your Excellency, I have to ask, since you're here, you've come in from Ukraine, how are you? How is your family?
Assalamu alaikum. Greetings from Ukraine. I'm very happy to join this discussion, dear moderator, distinguished panelists, and the audience. Probably it's the most difficult question to answer. Really, I mean it. This morning, I woke up for the first time without spending hours in the bomb shelter, for the first time. Because the whole month, every night and during the day, many times we just spend hours in the bomb shelters, and this is not the Netflix decoration, it's our reality. And the first time when I cried, it was yesterday. It will be a very personal reflection. I'm very sorry for this in advance, but I think that I have to have a certain therapy with you. I was flying from Warsaw to Doha yesterday. I was sitting in the first class, eating nice food, and for the first time since the war started, I allowed myself to cry, because when you go out of your country and you are not in the state of war, so you kind of feel it, and this feeling is really awful. A couple of days before, the place where I stay, for the safety reasons, we don't say where we stay. It's in Ukraine, but there is a coffee shop, the only available coffee shop. I went to that coffee shop and I heard two-year-old boy screaming and bursting in happiness, saying to his mama, "Oh, it's so great we were not bombed today." And I was just stunned, and I was very numb listening to this. Yesterday I was walking, the day before I was walking on the street, and again for the first time I allowed myself to listen what people discuss. It was a great weather in Ukraine, and people were talking. There was a group of teenagers, 13, 12-year-old girls. They were not discussing, love affairs or cosmetics. They were discussing biological and chemical weapons. The other family, they were discussing their relatives who moved to Poland and the other places. And this is, again, reality of my country. And as we speak about misinformation, I believe that the most cynical disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, active measures that we have is when Russia is naming it a special operation. Special operation that aims to cleanse Ukrainians from Ukrainians, Ukrainians from Nazis and fascists and genocides, and the very misuse of notion of genocide to cover its own crime. This is probably the most cynical that we can see. And unfortunately, 10 million of Ukrainians already either became eternally displaced persons like myself. It happened to me in 2014 when I went from Crimea, my homeland. I was a journalist, by the way, working in Crimea those days. 3.5 million of Ukrainians already abandoned the country. Most of them are children and women. We have been attacked by over 1,200 missile rocket systems, different categories. We still have phosphor bombs putting on our cities and showering our cities, shellings of the hospitals, orphanages, ambulances. This is a crazy reality. 135 children already have been killed, thousands of those injured. And again, this is not a Netflix decoration. So if this is a very brief, let's say, attempt to just to share how it feels like to live in Ukraine. And it took me 18 hours to get from Ukraine to here. And I'm very happy to be here with you.
And as you can see, we're all happy you're here, and we're also grateful you shared. I don't know. I cannot imagine what you've gone through and how hard it is to leave and to process. So thank you for processing and sharing with us. As we segue into talking about misinformation now, let me ask you this. I mean, as a former journalist in Ukraine and now someone in politics, you've probably seen over the years the impact of propaganda. And I've just been struck by the number of Ukrainians I know personally who have family members in Russia who are completely indoctrinated. There's a friend of mine who was telling me she was getting her grandmother out of Dnipro, and her aunt, who is that woman's daughter, is in Moscow, and completely believed that the shelling was made up. And that's such a visceral sort of notion of how strong the propaganda and the disinformation is. How long have you been dealing with this, and how have you seen it change over the last few years?
Thank you for the question. I've been dealing with this, let's say, unprecedented level of propaganda that has been showering my country, it's been showering actually the Russian society itself for 8 years. One personal story, as I was a journalist, the day of the so-called referendum, 16th of March 2014, there was a very small room where the occupation authorities already have been informing the whole international community and hundreds of journalists who came to Crimea to depict the situation. And it was overcrowded, and there was a very small room and only a tiny passage to the audience, to the kind of, scene. And one man wearing T-shirt Russia, he was very kind of bold, 30-year-old man, he put his tripod right on this passage, put the camera on the top, started filming, and there was a European journalist who came up to him and hardly speaking Russian, requested him to move his tripod a little bit aside. And I was just standing in a mirror, listening to what was happening, and then he said, "This is my land now, and don't you dare tell me where should I film and could not film." And I was just, silently witnessing it, and this very moment I understood what happened to my homeland, so the Russian soldiers are here. The impact of the propaganda, I believe, has several dimensions. And what we now have with the surveys taking place in Russia, where 71% of Russian population support the murder of Ukrainians, where the overwhelming majority of Russians who were questioned by the telephone by one of the Ukrainian agencies, they support the further war on Poland and other Central European countries and Baltic states. I think that this is also a demonstration of a pervert, maniacal position when arguments and facts cannot be the ground of any discussion. I mean, when Minister Lavrov in Antalya says that the maternity house that has been bombed by Russians is a fake, this means something. When you say, you show the pictures of killed children, it doesn't work, they say it's a fake, it means something. Because I've been studying and researching the propaganda, and as far as I believe, and I feel it, that there is this difference between Goebbels' classic propaganda, when the idea is to convince you that this is not the water, but it's a bottle of wine. So the classic Russian propaganda is about losing trust, is about making you doubt, if it's true or not. Because let us say if war is happening in Ukraine, we know, I mean, Ukrainians know exactly and perfectly well what has been happening in Ukraine. Probably neighboring countries know, European countries know. But let us imagine if Gulf countries know. Probably not, or not that informed. And then when the showers of Russia today pieces and episodes take place, and they name it totally different when they say it's not black, it's white, or they name it a special operation, that the war in Donbass was a civil war, not the war of Russia against Ukraine, that the occupation of Crimea was not occupation, it was the so-called referendum of people. So it means that people, they just do not, it's one position versus another position. So then people kind of don't know whom to trust. And when there is kind of lack of trust, it's always easier to put, manipulation on the top. And as far as the resources of Russia cannot be compared to any of the resources that European countries have, even the United States does not allocate that much money into broadcasting or into, public diplomacy. Because Russian military doctrine directly says that the cognitive influence is the part of their war. And I believe that we are in a third world war, not the conventional one, but information one.
That's just terrifying the way you put it, but I agree, and part of this whole thing is when you kill the media, when, very sensible people are exposed to a certain type of information for a very long time, they start to believe it, and when trust in the system is broken, that creates the conditions. Let me bring in our other panelists as well. Todd, you've studied as an academic Russian disinformation now for so long. What strikes you in well, first of all, are you surprised at all at any of the things we've seen over the last few months in the lead up to this invasion? And as you mull that, what are you seeing in the current mode of propaganda that you think is new or different?
Well, thank you, and thank you for your comments. I think for many analysts, one of the biggest surprises was the initial failure on the part of Russia to effectively convey any sort of coherent, believable message regarding its operations in Ukraine. Initially, I think they probably had an opportunity to galvanize some support among far-right audiences in the US and Europe, and if they could have done that, I think that could have done a lot to undermine support in the West and to limit the type of support that Ukraine is getting right now. They weren't able to do that, and I would give some credit to the US efforts at releasing intelligence. I think it really prevented Russia from using the narrative of some sort of Ukrainian attack on Russian forces. So big kudos to US intelligence community for doing that. But things are starting to evolve now. We're starting to see some in the far right be more comfortable aligning themselves with Russia's position. We're starting to see the sharing of narratives. Again,
this is the American far right.
American far right. I imagine it's happening in Europe as well. But with the American far right starting to echo messages from the Kremlin, and the Kremlin is echoing messages back from the American far right. And so we're starting to see Russia have some success putting a wedge between American societies. And that has been the goal of Russian propaganda from the get-go, from the 2016 election, to drive a wedge between the right and the left, between Americans on one side and Americans on the other side. So that is starting to happen again now. So I think that is the biggest challenge, the initial failure, but now we're seeing some success. Efforts that can continue to limit the impact of Russian propaganda, I think will be foundational to supporting Ukraine. Were Russia to gain support within American political audiences, if that support was able to go mainstream and by any means, I think that would be very deleterious for support for Ukraine. So continuing to counter this disinformation will be key.
Elizabeth, let me bring you in. You worked at Facebook for so long, and you have such a deep understanding of platforms and how the private sector plays into the information game. What's your sense of, currently how the private sector and the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of them, how they've, the role they've played in the last couple of months?
Yes, thank you, Ravi, and Deputy Minister Dzhaparova, thank you for sharing your personal story with us and bringing that to the stage. It's really appreciated. This is really a seminal moment, a shift, I would say, in the way that the tech sector, as a group of companies and as platforms where information is shared, is approaching the current crisis. If we think about some of the biggest players in the private sector that are in this space, we're about 2 decades in, more or less, to their development. And I think there's really 3 things that stand out to me in the moment we're in right now. One of them is, historically, a number of the biggest players in platform technology have preferred to see themselves as operating a foreign policy, if you will, that is on the side of the people. Good, well-intentioned people that are out there to help each other and do good in society and build their businesses. And while that is such an incredible philosophy and idea, it is totally impractical and doesn't actually map to how the real world works. The real world still operates in a group of nation states that have their own laws, their own policies, their own governance structures. And so I think, in a way, it's been a bit of a coming of age for tech companies to realize that while it's so compelling to have this idea that they're on the side of good people, the practical workings of the world make that something that actually doesn't really mean anything in today's world, and they have to get real about that. They have to address the fact that they need to have their own foreign policy that maps to how the world actually works. And then that gets into the second big shift that's happening, which is, if you notice, behind the scenes at the tech companies, they are totally restructuring their leadership teams to address this shift. Historically, a tech company would be built on its leadership level, where you go from investing in engineering to investing in growth to addressing investing in sales and monetization strategy. And then later you kind of get into policy and regulatory issues and all of that. Now what we're starting to see is that some of the bigger players, like the Facebooks, the Metas of the world, are elevating their policy leadership to a C-suite level that reports directly to the CEO. And we're seeing newer, younger players in tech start to invest heavily in trust and safety teams earlier on in the game, rather than wait so long to figure out their strategy there. I think more needs to be done, and later in the session I'm happy to come back to that a bit. I think every tech company needs to have a chief diplomatic officer, field officers on the ground. There needs to be a much bigger investment in this space, but at least it's starting, and at least they're realizing that that leadership at the corporate level needed to change in order to more readily adapt to what's going on. And then finally, of course, the algorithm. The algorithm historically has very much been driven by popularity. And although a number of, I'm sure, academics and researchers out there, Todd, you and your cohort, have tried to push the tech companies to see their algorithm differently, it's very, very hard to get that message across. Now we're actually finally starting to see the companies use deprioritization in the news feed, shift around their algorithm. They have to understand the responsibility that they play as curators in this space, and it's about time, frankly.
Yeah, or way past time, I would say. But I'll come back to this because the issue of regulating platforms is an important one to discuss, but also when you use phrases like foreign policy, that also comes with responsibility. And I think that's an issue that the tech sector at large needs to grapple with. Your Excellency, I'll bring you back in here. And it's hard to not keep coming back to the here and now of what your country's dealing with. But, information has played such a huge part of the last 2 months. As you've pointed out, Russia's disinformation, America's sort of centering and putting out the intelligence that it has in a very transparent way. But then also President Zelensky's very intelligent, I would say, and transparent messaging, just speaking directly to the people of Ukraine, but also the world. How much of this was thought through at a policy level, if you're able to speak about that, and how much of it is just, reacting in the moment?
I think for 8 years that we've been through, starting since 2014, when the occupation had been covered up in this so-called true referendum and voice of people, when the war in Donbass that was fueled up by Russia and actually launched by Russia because of the weapon delivery and the coordination has been called a civil war, when today's war is not called a war, when it's about special operation, when Russians helping Ukrainians to be cleansed from Nazis like myself, who live in Kiev, and this whole picture and narrativization of their own crime actually made us resilient. We have a bunch of NGOs, we have a bunch of experts who understand what Russians have been doing, and again, my main message is that but for the conventional war that we have, when weapons are there, when soldiers are there, there is this invisible front, information war front. And the effect of this war is much greater than we even think it is. It's like a radiation. You don't see it, but it really affects your mental health, it affects your perception, because at the end of the day, you make your choice, including your political choice, because of your perception. And I think that for Russia, it's crucial to influence, these choices via platforms, via media, via gongos, via experts, via musicians, via sportsmen.
These are choices for Russians or Ukrainians?
No, I mean, the choices not only for Russians. I mean, Russians are fully showered, but I believe that they have enough resources to be integrated in even European societies. When they use migration against Europe, when they use energy against Europe, when they use business against Europe. So it's this hybrid warfare that we call, when they take the very instruments of democracy, they direct it against democracies, and what they do at the end of the day, they influence the choices and they influence the moods, I believe it's something that is very much underestimated. And the Western perception, when it goes to the information wars, it mostly focuses on cyber wars, right? On this very kind of sizable thing.
Overt.
But what is underestimated is this cognitive influence, is this information war that shapes perceptions, that shapes moods, that shapes and influences the choices. And I believe that Russia is very much inventive in fighting these instruments. When it goes to Ukraine, as far as I said, we are resilient, and I think that our motto is actually the best counter-propaganda is truth. And what we're trying to do is to deliver this truth by every possible mean, starting from our president, who is today, I believe, the embodiment of the courage of my nation that has been resisting for a month. Because, look, I will be very honest, and I think that you all know that Russian initial plan was to have a blitzkrieg and to occupy and to take control over Ukraine in 3 days. And then within this small period of time, the whole world would be silent, same as happened in 2014. And I'm sure, as far as, again, I'm from Crimea, I saw it with my own eyes. Our inability in 2014 to give a proper response for aggression, I mean, not only Ukraine and Ukrainian army that was not raised, but also international community that silenced up this issue. So this inability caused us and brought us to this war. And my message is that if we are unable to stop it in Ukraine, and if we are not able to stop Putin in Ukraine now, believe me, this aggression will be bigger, because it's always about this nature of evil. When it's not stopped, it becomes bigger. And information is part of this evil, It's something that you can't see, you cannot touch it, but it's huge because it gives you certain flavor of things. And I believe that it's very cynical. Just to end up my speech, I remember when I was in Crimea, there was a press conference of President Putin, and when he was asked if this was Russian army that occupied Crimea, he said, no, this was not Russian army. You can go and buy the military uniform in any shop. These are the local people. And then in 2 weeks, he said that the situation in Ukraine turned out that we had to act and save Russian people. We don't understand what kind of slavery was it. But this highest level of disinformation and very cynical historical pretext that he comes up, and in a week before the war started, he had this long speech in his attempt to explain to his population that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. So I believe this is the classic study case for how impactful and how brutal and how cynical can be the disinformation campaign that comes out from the leader, from the first person of any state.
That's just fascinating. You know, obviously with Ukraine right now, it's so clear that you can fight this disinformation because it is existential. And so Ukraine in this moment is so united. But then if you think of a democracy that is fractured, or a country that has two parties or several parties that are fighting each other, that's when this disinformation can really sort of seep into a culture and a country and have other kinds of adverse effects and not be fought off the way your country and your government is. Todd, let me come back to you now, just as an academic, as someone who's studied how to fight disinformation. Let me put you on the spot. If there are three things that countries can do to better protect themselves from disinformation, not misinformation, what would those be?
So at one level, there is a need to reduce demand and the influence of the information at the individual level. So certainly things like media literacy, education is really foundational to help a society sort of better discriminate between information that's real and information that's false. There are things that the platforms and the governments can do to support that. Things like corrections on social media, labeling of foreign propaganda content, which our own research has shown is effective. So all of that helps to sort of protect the individual consumer level. I think the next step on the chain is just limiting the flow of that information. And so that's where you have the responsibility of the tech sector and the platforms that, you know, if the content is covert, in other words, if it's a troll account pretending to be somebody else, that account gets outed and removed. So deplatforming fake and propaganda content is key. As I mentioned before, labeling, that is key. And then there's an assortment of policies that I'm sure Elizabeth can speak to, but advertising policies, limiting the opportunity for foreign adversaries to do advertising on those platforms, and a variety of host of other platform policies. At the national level, I think there needs to be sort of warnings from the government about content, about campaigns that are seen. And the US, for example, I think did that fairly well in Ukraine, to publicly announce foreign disinformation campaigns as they're coming, which helps to protect, I think, individual audiences. And then some level of foreign deterrence, I think. There needs to be something at the national level that is conveyed to foreign adversaries about the consequences that will be engendered if these types of campaigns continue. And I think in the United States, that is something that has been sorely missing, is that sort of like imposition of costs ahead of time. We do a lot of punishment and sanctions, but little imposition of costs and a clarification of costs as a form of deterrent strategy. So I'd say those are just sort of a few of the things. And finally, last thing I'll note is just limiting the opportunity to monetize this stuff. I mean, right now there is companies like the BBC, Puma, and other well-known companies are funding disinformation about Ukraine at this very moment, because you all see the advertisements that show up on your web screen, and those advertisements are funding disinformation content. So ads for BBC are showing up on known disinformation websites. So that is funding it. It's creating this entire incentive structure for it, and you know, it could be stopped if there was a will and a way. So, thank you.
Elizabeth, to bring you back in on the platforms, and I know I keep putting you on the spot on this, you left Facebook a long time ago, but part of the problem with platforms as they exist, you know, obviously they have to monetize first, that's how they think. Advertising is everything. They cannot take responsibility in that they like to say, we're platforms, we're not content creators necessarily, but then that's the loophole because they're not responsible. And, you know, as someone who runs a newsroom, I can tell you there's no way that a social media company can do the same thing in terms of fact-checking every single thing that's out there. So it's kind of lose-lose in that sense. Do you think tech companies get that? Or are they just saying, come regulate us, and they're hoping that nothing really comes of that?
Yeah, well, I think you use a few key pieces of vocabulary there. I think, first of all, a number of people in the tech sector are using that push to say, please regulate us, almost as a way to get out of coming up with creative solutions ourselves. We can do better, and we should be doing better than to put out those pleas. And I think in the long term, we actually need to have a check and balance between the role of the government and the role of the tech company. If those two are hand in hand in figuring out this regulation long term, that puts us, I think, in a precarious position. But coming back to your point on responsibility, the responsibility and the sense of responsibility has been one of the biggest pain points in California tech, and it's always bothered me. And I think one of the reasons why is, as you said, it comes back from this deep-seated concept of saying that the platforms should not be responsible for what others post on the platform. And in many ways, historically, that of course has made sense for the internet, given the way that the internet environment works. But unfortunately, what it's done is it's, I think, taken the leadership team and the decision makers at the companies too far outside of the conversation. Every single time we hop on our news feeds on these platforms, every single time we turn on traditional news channels, we should be exposed to and seen directly from these platform companies the kinds of traps we need to be aware of so that we don't fall into them. If you think about the way that the banking sector is trying to double down on helping people understand where and how to spot fraud, that's the sort of conversations we need to have on where and how to spot propaganda and misinformation. And the fact that those spokespeople are just missing, in my opinion, is a huge problem, because we should be seeing this everywhere we look. And I think most people in our societies have no idea what's going on behind the scenes at these companies to spot this propaganda, to understand it. So there's a huge amount of consumer education that we need to do, and I think the companies have a role in that, and I would go as far as to say a responsibility in that. And I think the reason spokespeople at the companies tend to hide is because there's a sense of not wanting to show responsibility. But that's exactly what the world needs. Just a quick solution piece, because I know you wanted to push us on solutions. We all know that the scale of information is something that we've never seen before. This is so complicated when it comes to the billions of people that are connected to some of these platforms. But I do think we're seeing a rise in scale of information come up in parallel to a rise of really exciting new trends in how people are working. Not every fact checker brought in by these companies needs to be that full-time employee that they're giving, that they have on staff all the time. We need to think about such new opportunities to say, in any given language and region of the world, how do we ensure that the college students, that the teachers, that the parents have what they need to be equipped with to be able at the last minute to be enlisted to give a few hours of their time every week? This is the 21st century. We can and should be thinking about new ways to take the way that the work is going and employment is going and the gig economy is going, and map that into what we need to help on the information environment, which otherwise is unsustainable in the way we've traditionally addressed it in the past.
That's a good point there. Thank you for bringing in one solution. I want to bring in some questions from our audience. Otherwise, it's going to be me hogging this the entire time. I see a hand there. I see several hands. This is great. Okay. Where do we have someone with a microphone? So we'll take one there. I have a request. I'll try and take 2 or 3 questions in one go. It has to be short, and it has to end with a question mark. Go.
Thank you. We have heard many speeches by Zelensky condemning foreign occupation, aggression, and then we heard him in Israel saying that Israel is under threat. And from what I understand from international law, Israel is an occupying country, occupying Palestine. This is a consensus of the United Nations, and I don't understand how he can say from one side we are against aggression and occupation, and then in some way praising the Israeli occupation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'll take a couple more questions and we'll try and put them to our panelists. Right up here, second row, there's a gentleman who's standing up. We'll take yours. Again, questions, please, related to misinformation.
Minister, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm Guido Gianasso, I'm the Honorary Consul General of Romania. Question number one, what are the chances that Ukraine can recover Crimea? And question number two, how vulnerable do you think it is now and in the future, Moldova? Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to take one more question over there, if you can stand up. And again, I realize we're in a very historic moment, war is on, but let's try and, if we can, stick to misinformation and radicalization over there. Yes.
Thank you. Osman Saad from Ankara Institute, Turkey. I want to ask a question to Todd, please. Now the Western countries started to ban the Russian-sponsored media outlets, but they are manipulating the countries not today, for a while, and RAND Corporation has amazing documents about it. But what is the border between, banning all the Russian-sponsored media outlets, but just sometimes Fox News is as biased as the Russian ones regarding the foreign policy, and just keeping the freedom of expression and just stopping the manipulation? Thank you.
All right, thank you there. Okay, so let's try some answers. If I can get a quick one from you, Your Excellency, and then Todd.
The first one related to Israel. I think that it's better to go and check how Ukraine votes in the United Nations when it comes to the Palestinian and Israel conflict resolution. I think this is the best answer that I can give, not commenting the words of my President Zelensky, who is actually trying to do his best to find mediation to resolve the war. The second, how vulnerable is Moldova? Vulnerable, absolutely, absolutely the same vulnerable as other European countries that are bordering with Ukraine, Poland, Baltic countries, Central European countries. They are all vulnerable because I have a very evident parallel that goes to the Second World War, when Western world thought that they may appease Hitler by giving him Sudetenland and closing the eyes after the Austrian Anschluss, and then just having a little bit of time before the war started. So Crimea and Donbass for Putin is the same as Sudetenland and Austria for Hitler. And if we think that by appeasing and dancing tango with an aggressor, we will kind of, it will be enough, this will not be enough, and my president is very articulated about this. The limit between freedom of expression and freedom of lie is very thin. It's quite difficult, to feel it, to sense it. I think that there is an urgent need to come up with new rules, new conventions that will actually fix the new rules and how countries that want to be democratic should act under this unprecedented level of danger when it's really quite difficult to have this line. Thank you. I think I answered all of the questions.
That was very, you handled all of them very well. Thank you. Todd, very quickly.
All right, I think the question was, why does Facebook and other platforms ban Russian propaganda but not Fox News? Is that the question?
Essentially.
But, it's not on Facebook. Just what I'm trying to, ask is, just banning Russia Today or some, in Turkey, when you're driving your car, you are listening radio from China's voice or the Russian, and you don't understand what is lie and you can ban it, you can put limits. But where is the border between keeping the freedom of expression and just stopping the manipulation? That's a difficult thing.
Yeah, I feel you. It's a hard question because, and I can't speak for the platforms. Elizabeth can probably would do much better than that. I would say my assumption is the platforms are loath to deplatform anybody, are probably loath to remove content. And they have specific policies that they've created, and in theory and hopefully they would abide by those policies. And so content that gets removed is removed based on those policies. I can't, I think it's important to note that while Facebook, for example, has banned or has limited Russian pages from Russian state-sponsored media, in the United States and Europe. It's not a worldwide thing. Russia is still disseminating content via pages in Arabic language Russia Today, in Spanish language Russia Today. You know, they're not banning everything. I think they're being fairly specific about which items they ban. And I don't want to go into why they're doing it now versus other times. I guess you could argue they should always ban it. But I think their general position is banning is the last thing they want to do. Preventing deplatforming is the last thing they want to do.
Because where do you stop? Yeah, very quickly, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I can just come in quickly on that. I think there's, so one case study to look up in terms of the balance between freedom of expression and a reversal of that policy is historically a platform like Facebook allowed content that denied the Holocaust on its platform. And the reason they allowed that in a country like the United States is because it is not illegal to deny the Holocaust in the United States of America. When the company went into countries like Germany, in Germany, Holocaust denial content is illegal, and so the company needed to IP block that content. That was a very challenging position to defend at the time that I was at the company. And that policy has actually been reversed. So that content is now no longer, denying the Holocaust is no longer content that is allowed on the Facebook platform. In part because, you know, it's of course the right thing to do, but we also have seen that the company has realized that a far greater percentage of the population is susceptible to believing what they see on the internet than what was originally thought at the time. So that's one case study to look up if you're interested kind of in seeing how these policies are shifting. And the emerging area is what is essentially the penal code for inciting violence on social media. So we're starting to see that, you know, these takedown policies that are getting reviewed by something like the Facebook Oversight Board are starting to take shape. But it still is a bit nebulous what that actually looks like, you know, from a law enforcement perspective that we're accustomed to in the real offline world.
All right, let's try and take one or two last questions. Many hands. Okay, the gentleman over there in the middle, and then we'll take your question and we'll move to the one there. But let's hear it first. A question, please.
Thank you. There's more and more in the misinformation campaign on Ukraine. You hear in Europe the people supporting Ukraine as the party of war versus the party of peace. And my question is, with that kind of manipulation of the discussion, do the images coming from Ukraine, when the terrible images we see from Ukraine, are they going to reinforce the people who want to support Ukraine? On the contrary, reinforce the camp of people who just want to stay at a distance from the horrors of war in Ukraine?
Her Excellency was asking, you're not talking about refugees here, you're talking about the imagery, is that right?
The image, yes, of the bombing, of all the horrors that are happening.
And what is the question again?
The question is, I mean, in Europe, you see a debate where the people who support Ukraine are characterized as the party of war, as if the party of peace is people who want to stay at a distance from Ukraine. And my question is, do these images of war, of the atrocities happening in the cities of Ukraine, are they going to reinforce the sympathy for Ukraine, or down the road are they going to reinforce the people who want to stay at a distance and be as neutral as possible?
Got it. Okay, we got the question this time. The gentleman over there, if you can stand up, we'll take your question. Might try and combine it with one more last question after that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm a journalist too, like the Excellency here, and I have to comment very shortly that we have a problem with whataboutism. They are telling a line, you're starting to fact check it, they are already popping up from a completely different hole. So, but the question is mostly to Todd and Elizabeth. There is a lot of talking recently that the Russians are going to cut them out of global internet, to leave it. Chinese are doing it in a more intelligent way. So what's the future of archipelago of internet, not global network, but specific countries with specific regimes closing the gates of their castles and probably opening them just for information aggression toward the free world?
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
What aboutism? Okay, I'll take one last question and then we do have to close. Right there on the aisle, if you can stand up. Yes, that's you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Peter Misek at Access Now. I guess my question is a corollary to the earlier one. Should all U.S. tech companies pull out of Russia and Belarus, or are they kind of the last remaining hope to break through disinformation?
Fascinating. Okay. Let us see if we can get very quick answers. Why don't we go in the direction from you, Elizabeth, all the way this way. But you could start with the question of whether tech companies should pull out of Russia. Would that help or not?
Yeah, well, this is certainly, of course, one of the most active debates in each sector right now is how to best handle the balance between ensuring that, people have access to information, but not access to propaganda. What I would say, and what we're starting to see, and this then gets into the question of the fracturing of the internet, is it's so important to innovate ahead of government regulation. And the tech sector historically has a pretty decent track record of trying to figure out how to make that happen, either through acquiring companies that are still flying under the radar that government hasn't yet noticed and going about it that way, or in proactively assisting and aiding organizations that help citizens figure out workarounds. And having done a lot of training with civil society leaders in the past, there are a number of NGOs out there that are in the business of essentially doing that, helping citizens circumvent their own policies to get access to information. And we have to be honest about that space, and we have to be honest about what it means for companies to help in that effort.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Very quickly.
First, on closing the gates of the castle, which is a great phrase, I'll say that, Putin needs to close the gates to the castle. He needs to. The level of casualties, the incompetence of the Russian military, the amazing attitude and defense and stoicism coming out of Ukraine. He can't survive politically where that information can get in. And so I get why he needs to do it. But there's also a strategic imperative for the West, for the United States, to continue to find ways, and for the Ukrainians, to find ways to push information into the Russian ecosphere. Whether that is through finding ways to broadcast into Russia or using Russian friends and family who live in the United States, who live in the West, but that's necessary. On the second part, on the images, the best way to counter disinformation is with real information. It's not by saying the disinformation is wrong. It's by showing what is really happening. And the images coming out of Ukraine are amazing. Amazing in the sense of their ability to show what is really happening, their ability to completely overwhelm Russia's disinformation sphere. And it's crowdsourced, it's genuine, it's authentic. It's like rewriting the book on information operations. And even if it wasn't a policy decision on the Ukrainian part, the people are taking up on it, and it's amazing. And I'll just say, I think the West needs to find ways to support these influencers in Ukraine to help them continue to do what they're doing.
I couldn't agree more. Your Excellency, I'll give you the last word.
When you look at the sky and you see the image of the sky, it doesn't mean that you will reinforce the blue color of the sky. You just see the sky and you make your own perception and your feeling about the sky and its color. When you look at the pictures of war, it's the same about showing the reality. It's nothing more, or it's about showing you the truth. So this is our frank and honest position. We want to show the truth. And when we show and depict the war in pictures, not we, international journalists do this. It's about showing what reality is in my country, how people die, how they starve. Because, for example, in Mariupol, I mean it, children have been buried in the backyards because they don't have enough food or water. And this is about showing this reality. But there is another issue, and when it goes to Russia again, I mean, look, it's 140 million nation. And what actually, the discussion, not only in Ukraine, but also in the Western world, what should we do with those zombies? It's the majority of the population. When you speak and show the facts and arguments, it doesn't work. You cannot break through. I had this issue in 2014. I had friends in Moscow, and when the occupation of Crimea happened, I was just trying to explain what we had. We had Russian soldiers, and it was unimaginable. You know, they are well-educated people. Every time that I brought any argument, they couldn't, I mean, they never trusted. And this is the fact. Like, we have millions of Russians not trusting to anyone, you know, praying for Putin. It's like a cult. It's like a sect, you know. So I think that this is an issue no one knows how to deal with. And I think that just, you know, resuming this all, I believe that responsibility is a very important issue. Responsibility of what we say, of what we do, and how we try to image something. And I still think that there is a need for frank conversation. What are the instruments? Because democracies, they don't have enough instruments. And when we started, I remember when in 2014 we just squeezed out Russian TV channels from the Ukrainian cable system, 82 Russian channels. I remember this whole Western conversation, oh, you're kind of stepping on the freedom of expression, so on and so far. But we said, no, we have to protect ourselves from these showers of lies. So it's always about finding this balance, but sometimes I don't think that balance is possible.
Well, I really hope that it will be, and you know, we're all rooting for Ukraine to come out of this crazy and unjust and unnecessary war. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists, Elizabeth Linder, Todd Helmus, and Her Excellency Emine Dzhaparova. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us today. Thank you to you, our audience. I'm Ravi Agrawal from FPE. Thanks for being here.